You're very welcome to this video about whether NATO expansion objectively constituted a threat to Russia or whether it didn't. Now, if you're watching this, you're likely to have watched some videos of mine, not just on this, but also on the main channel. And you know that in this war, I support Ukraine. And you know that in this war, I support the interests of the West and a commitment to liberal democracy. And I support NATO, at least to the extent to which I think that proposals by green parties or strongly left-wing parties in the Western world today to dissolve NATO or for their country to leave NATO are great strategic blunders. And I don't just support the West and Ukraine, I also support Russia's national interests in this war, because this war is a gross act of long-distance historical self-harm by Russia. So let's start the conversation about NATO casually and maybe start with the points that indicate that it could be a threat. So number one point, I think, in that ballpark for me is that many international relations experts, many political commentators make a really basic mistake and have made it for years and decades. And the mistake is to think that Vladimir Putin has been exploiting the issue of NATO expansion to realize some of his goals, but that privately he hasn't really considered NATO expansion a threat. Now, did Putin genuinely exploit the issue of NATO expansion? Yes. I mean, that's one of the central aspects of his political project. He was trying for years to get Russia to a state in which it was a kind of a bent twig, to borrow an analogy from Isaiah Berlin, that was bent so far one way that, boom, it was going to snap back the other way in an aggressive outburst of imperialism. Now, while Putin certainly was exploiting the issue, it's also true as a matter of biographical and psychological fact that Putin's genuinely really riled up by NATO expansion, really riled up by several NATO interventions, really riled up by several non-NATO interventions, but interventions led by major NATO states, and really riled up by his nightmare worst-case scenario vision, which is not unrelated to why he's gone into Ukraine now. And that's the vision that what happened to Gaddafi happens to him. So Putin is genuinely wound up about this. He was deeply wound up by NATO intervention in the former Yugoslavia. He, I think, still carries a kind of trauma from that. Trauma around the sense of Russia being disregarded in this process. So in purely psychological and biographical terms, sorry, but Putin is legitimately worked up about this. Not legitimately as in he is right, but legitimately as in for real, he's not making it up. Number two, did NATO fundamentally reform itself at the end of the Cold War to reassure Russia that it was no longer a enemy military alliance? This is complex, debatable. I would say I'd submit the answer no on balance. Number three, is NATO a purely defensive alliance? Several of you have written comments under videos on this and on the main channel too, that it's a purely defensive alliance. No. I mean, that's completely insupportable. What happened in Libya? Who was defending themselves? Which NATO state was defending themselves when the intervention in Libya happened? Which NATO state was defending itself when the intervention in the former Yugoslavia happened? Now, you might say, well, at the time I supported these interventions. I support them now, you might say. Well, sure, we don't even need to enter that conversation, but humanitarian intervention is not defensive if you see these interventions as such. So it's impossible to call NATO a purely defensive alliance. 3. Were promises given to Russia of an informal kind that NATO wouldn't expand as far eastwards as it did? Yes, they were. Were they informal? Yes, they were. 4. Is it the case that somebody who isn't Putin would have been concerned about NATO expansion, somebody in Putin's place? Let's make this even more interesting. Imagine that Russia had become and stayed way more democratic than it was in the early years of the Putin regime. And imagine it stayed that way. And imagine it had a totally different leader who believed in democracy. But then imagine that Russia wasn't a member of NATO. Would it be a security issue for Russia for NATO to be expanding? Yeah, it would. It would. In other words, it's virtually inconceivable for any Russian leader, even the leader of a democratic Russia, to have not found NATO expansion a strategic concern. Not necessarily more than that, but certainly that. I mean, it would just be culturally, historically, politically implausible to imagine anything else. The only alternative would be if Russia actually joined NATO. So, therefore, Putin is legitimately worked up about it. NATO is not merely a defensive alliance. NATO didn't radically reform at the end of the Cold War. Promises were given that NATO wouldn't expand, and it did. And then much more reasonable and normal leaders who aren't Putin would have been concerned about NATO expansion. I'm sure there are more points to make, but let's just leave it at these 5 that are points that indicate that there could be a case for NATO being an objective threat, and NATO expansion being an objective threat to Russia's national interests. Now let's look at the other side. And I think that what's clear, first of all, is that NATO is only a major threat to Putin because Putin is convinced that any scenario under which there are countries around his border that either go democratic or belong to this foreign military alliance, that these countries are a threat to him, especially at a time when he becomes weakened. He continues to experience a higher and higher risk of being shoved away. If something happens and he is about to be shoved away, it's a total catastrophe for Putin to have around his border countries that could be used as platforms to support whatever momentum there's already inside Russia to get rid of Putin. That's a kind of ultimate nightmare scenario, and that's one of the reasons for the brutal assault on Ukraine. And this nightmare Putin genuinely associates with what happened with Saddam Hussein, which is not a NATO intervention, but an intervention with major NATO states involved, and what happened to Gaddafi. These are all nightmare scenarios for Putin because he's trying to stay in power forever, and when he reaches a point when that's not quite sustainable, he doesn't want the possibility of any platforms on Russia's border to assist the momentum to overthrow him. Now, so once you get rid of a autocratic / now totalitarian, quarter totalitarian leader who's keen on staying in power forever, who is keen on there being no democracy in Russia, no democracy in Russia's borders, then you end up in a situation where NATO is not anywhere near as big a threat to Russia as it feels for a leader of that kind. So much of this perception of threat is predicated on Russia having an illegitimate government. As soon as Russia has a legitimate government, if it were to get one, NATO would become much, 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 much less of a threat. So that's clear. Now, what else is clear is that even if you are starting from where we are today, which is that you've got this authoritarian leader who cannot tolerate democracy inside or around Russia, there's no chance that NATO would invade or attack Russia directly. There's just no chance of that. Proxy wars are happening. There is a proxy war going on right now. But there was no chance of NATO attacking Russia. Just none. So when we're talking about a threat, even from the vantage point of a Putin, NATO is not a threat at the level of it being conceivable that it would invade Russia. It's a threat in an indirect sense, and a direct threat only in a very, very hypothetical sense, with many removed hypotheticals needing to be actualized before we could even begin talking about NATO invading Russia. So let's call that a second point on the side of minimizing the suggestion that NATO is a threat. Let's now add a third point here, which is really crucial, and that's that the countries that joined NATO have agency. Now, you've heard this point before many, many times, but let's be very clear about what we mean here. We're not making a moral point, we're making a political point. That's why John Mearsheimer, that's not the only reason why, but that's why John Mearsheimer is mistaken. That's why Noam Chomsky can sound like he's not balancing this conversation right. That's why somebody who's making the Mearsheimer and Chomsky argument in some, at least in some version of it, better than them, Jeffrey Sachs, is also missing something here. And what's being missed is that the agency that Ukraine has, let's talk about this war for a second, and we'll come back to NATO states. But the agency that Ukraine has isn't just some kind of moral agency, that it's got some kind of moral right to this or to that. No, the issue of Ukraine's agency is real. It's a practical fact we have to reckon with. We have to calculate it in, because if we don't, we'll just be dealing with magical thinking. And so when folks like John Mearsheimer say, well, we shouldn't be inviting Ukraine to defend itself, we shouldn't be making the case that Ukraine should defend itself, we shouldn't be giving it weapons, this is just utterly unreal. Ukraine just would defend itself. Ukraine is overtaken by an anti-colonial movement that's actually turned out to be present even in the more Russia-sympathetic parts of the country. And so the same point about agency being not just a moral but a practical reality needs to be said about the East European countries who joined NATO. The question here is very, very simple. Did these countries join NATO for reasons of some kind of phobia and anxiety, or did they have legitimate security concerns which NATO solved? Yes, of course they had legitimate security concerns. In fact, they've always looked like they were right, that they needed to get into NATO to feel safe from Russia. But now the war in Ukraine has proved them 10 times over right, you know? So this is the really, really big problem with the story about NATO expansion as some kind of sort of, you know, outward permeation of a useless Western military alliance. What that story is missing is that, yes, NATO is expanding itself, but it's not just eating up these countries that are joining it. They are desperate to join. And if we were in these countries, and some of you may be, the case for joining is pretty strong. It's pretty strong. Now, we're going to see what happens in the next weeks and months and years what Putin's position is in terms of whether he wants to engage in more direct conflict with NATO countries. I mean, he's open to that we know. How far he'll go is what we're going to have to see. But there's no doubt that these countries have agency. So that's point number 3. And that agency is a practical fact. It's not just some kind of a moral disposition. And also, moral dispositions are themselves part of practical reality. Look at how Western democracies are now being pushed by their citizens to take a harder stance on the Russian intervention in Ukraine. That's also moral sentiment as a practical fact. So look, the big problem is that no analysis of NATO expansion makes sense unless you make a central part of that analysis that there were many small countries that wanted to look after their security in a rational way and did so by joining NATO. Then the last thing I'm going to mention is that the people who go on about NATO expansion as the cause of Russia's intervention in Ukraine often end up saying that we should start negotiations because I'm sure we can work out some kind of deal with Putin taking this and that, Ukrainians keeping this and that, and we can work something out. Well, the problem with this is that we have argued many times on the main channel that Russia is engaged in a pattern of escalation that goes beyond Ukraine. And Russia is not just interested in adjusting some buffers with NATO. Russia is engaged, even though it's coming out of the bloc slowly, in a full frontal assault on the international order. And Russia is not interested in pushing back NATO in a delimited way. Russia is interested in fundamental change, either the dissolution of NATO or a reform of NATO so radical that it's inconceivably against the interests of NATO member states. So Putin is not wanting something delimited here that we can just negotiate on and solve this issue. Therefore, the conventional argument of NATO expansion as the cause of this war is at best partial and at worst wrong. Now, is NATO expansion, if we're going to be cartoonish about this, a part of what motivated Putin to engage in this brutal aggression against Ukraine? Yeah, but even if we said that it was, it's not going to be the number one thing, because the number one thing is this much broader story. It's this much broader project that goes beyond just redefining Russia-NATO borders and Russia-NATO zones in Eastern Europe. Putin is after a stake in world domination. He's after a situation that would leave Russia in the world where the norms of international security have been radically rearranged in a way that's A, impossible, and B, would be harmful to the interests of Western democracies. So Putin is after something impossible here. He's not just saying, guys, you've gone too far, I'm going to push you back a bit. He's engaged in a civilizational and large escalation against the West. So that's how I balance it, basically. Thank you so much for listening.